I've been slightly dreading this. I've been thinking about whether we were going to do this and when we were going to do it, and then actually trying to avoid this very question. I said, well, let's look up the biggest company in Mexico by income. And it turns out it is Pemex. Pemex, Mexico's embattled, controversial, and ridiculous microcosm, the oil company, the state-run oil company, is actually Mexico's biggest company, which you wouldn't actually realize if you read all the press about it, because the stats that you get about Pemex is the fact that it's the most indebted oil company on earth, and, according to The Guardian, the seventh most polluting company globally. But that convinced me to do this episode on Pemex. It's a fascinating topic. It's a topic that literally explains Mexico in a nutshell. It is a microcosm, but it also will determine Mexico's future, whether anyone wants it or not. And so I thought we could dive into it, especially given that you're here with us, Tavo, because you're a man deeply integrated into Pemex. You are basically a microcosm within a microcosm.
Yes, isn't that something you want to be? A microcosm of Pemex, the seventh most polluting company in the world. Yeah, I spent about a year of my life consulting for them in different parts of its operations, in petrochemicals and fertilizers, in exploration and production. So yeah, I agree with you. This is incredibly interesting. And not only is Pemex the largest company in Mexico, it is the second largest in all of Latin America, right? It used to be the largest in all of Latin America. It's now been overtaken by Petrobras in Brazil.
The other state-owned oil company just in the largest country in Latin America.
Right. And yeah, this is a subcontinent with 3 G20s, lots of mining, lots of oil, lots of very different things. There could be other companies that are very large, and there are. And that speaks to just how important and large Pemex and Petrobras are, that even in this, with so much competition for being so large, they remain the largest and have been the largest for a very long time.
And yet I don't want to understate another facet of Pemex, which is it's an enormous company. It's really important. It's incredibly troubled. And yet, one of the things that we'll definitely be talking about throughout this conversation is it's most of all politically one of the most important symbols in Mexico, and virtually represent Mexicanness in a way that no other company or institution represents Mexico, at least in the current state of affairs in Mexico currently under the Morena government. We'll definitely be getting to that, but we'll be seeing the origins of it. In fact, the beginning of what I would say is the closest historically aligned movement politically to Morena was born with the creation of Pemex. But let's get back to the stats first. How about that?
Just a little bit on that before. What you're saying about how important it is politically reminds me of a joke that an economics professor I had in the ITAM in Mexico used to say all the time, which is in Mayan sort of mythology, the Mayan people were made of corn. So the Popol Vuh says that we are the sons of corn, los hijos del maíz. And I had a professor, Isaac Katz, who used to say, well, that's only partially correct. Mexicans specifically are made of corn, yes, but stuck together with tar, because the obsession that Mexicans have with oil and with Pemex is just, it speaks to just how close to their heart is, how it seems that we're made of it. He always said, somos hijos del maíz, hechos de maíz, pegados con chapopote.
It has a better ring to it in Spanish.
But yes, back to the stats. I mean, there's so much that we can say about Pemex. How do you express how large and important a company is in a few stats? Well, there's a few numbers that come to mind. In 1982, Pemex represented almost 8% of global oil production, at a time in which the Mexican GDP only represented 1.6% of the global economy. It punched way, way above its weight. And even by 2004, where oil production had grown elsewhere, it still represented 5.5% of total global oil production. Not only that, but Pemex has always been incredibly important for the running of the state. And why is that? Because it has represented a huge chunk of federal tax revenue. In 1987, it was more than 40%. And even in 2008, okay, this is after the PRI, it represented 44% of total federal tax revenue. The country could not function without Pemex.
And that's where I guess we need to talk a bit about the origins of Pemex. Petróleos Mexicanos, Mexican oil. It's an agglomeration of different companies that didn't used to be public and didn't used to be Mexican, really. They were created after Mexico expropriated the entire oil industry in 1938 at a politically very interesting time. I think it's a stroke of genius by then President Lázaro Cárdenas, who went out to the central square amidst loads of people, his government, the crowds, and announced that he was nationalizing all these different oil companies, American, British, at a time when, I guess we're going back to this, when if you messed with a company from a different country, that country, if it was stronger than you, would muscle in. But this is 1938, so we're in the midst of the good neighbor policy from Franklin D. Roosevelt. Europe is on the verge of war. Asia is already in the midst of war. And so it's politically a very clever moment to do such a bold thing. And yet, it wasn't all that important back then, was it? I think what's interesting about the stats you're giving us now is it's only until the 80s oil become such a big part of Mexican public and financial life. So I'd like you, Tavo, to take us back a bit, because I think we've all focused on the fact that oil is really important to Mexicans from the very beginning, whereas actually the reason that the Americans could give up on losing all these companies owned by their co-nationals was the fact that oil wasn't all that important to Mexico back then, right? Or am I wrong?
No, that's true, definitely. So oil, it's funny that now we talk about it as if, Mexicans are made out of oil. But Mexico, having existed for 200 years, for more than 60% of Mexican history, oil is thoroughly irrelevant. It's not a particularly relevant resource. It's not a particularly important export. It's really until the 1920s that Mexico starts exporting a relatively important amount of oil to the U.S., specifically to the U.S., but that is only because of the great economic boom of the U.S. during the 1920s. And then after the 1920s, Mexican oil production falls significantly again, and it will remain pretty stagnant up until the 1970s. Oil did not determine pretty much anything in Mexican history before the 1970s, other than this massive political moment, which is 1938 and the expropriation or nationalization of these oil companies.
So the value back then was more political than anything else. It was a mark of Mexico's sovereignty, rather than a really valuable asset for the government to grab.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case in 1938, and that's sort of the rhetoric that Lázaro Cárdenas adopts. But 1920 or 1898 or whatever important moments in Mexican oil history before 1970, there wasn't really a significant question of sovereignty. Yes, this was a discussion. It is in the Constitution that things like oil, everything underground belongs to the state, but it wasn't a recurring conversation. And sort of going back to what you mentioned about how 1938 was a very strategic moment in time for Lázaro Cárdenas to carry out the nationalization, there's something else that we need to bear in mind, which is maybe the U.S. would have done something about this eventually. That has been the policy of the U.S. and other colonialist or proto-colonialist states since the beginning of time. But something happens after 1938, which leads things to change dramatically, which is the Second World War. A few years later, Lázaro Cárdenas leaves the presidency, and the new president comes in at a time of war, and the U.S. cannot afford to have a potential enemy on its border. The Germans would have loved to use Mexico as a place, or the Japanese as a place from which to launch attacks to the U.S. The U.S. cannot have this as an option. So whatever sort of retaliatory measures could have been considered are just thrown overboard entirely. So while everyone else suffered because of the Second World War, arguably Mexico is one of the biggest winners for this particular reason. Now, moving on past that, as we've said, oil in Mexico continues to be irrelevant afterwards. Okay, because the U.S. decides not to carry out retaliatory measures, the Second World War passes. We go through the 50s and 60s, and Mexico's growing a ton without oil. So why does oil become a relevant part of the story? Well, it all begins in the 1970s. In 1972, there is a man by the name of Rudecindo. That's his first name.
A very common name.
Exactly. And this man is a fisherman in the area of Tabasco and Campeche. And he is fishing and pulls out his nets and finds that they've been spoiled by oil. So he goes back to the Pemex headquarters in that area and goes to tell them, well, there's a bunch of oil in the middle of the sea. You should do something about it. And they go back and they find that there seems to be a significant amount of oil underground that's causing this, and they start exploring. In 1972, they find the first bits of relevant amounts of oil. Mexico goes from being, we use an analogy of an orchestra. Mexico used to be the guy playing the triangle when it came to oil. It's an important part of the orchestra, but it's not that important, right? 1972, it's promoted, let's say, to trumpet
second
number
fiddle.
6.
Yeah.
Second fiddle. Well, not even. It's more like it's back there in the brass, but not the most important brass. But
we're losing all our trumpet player listeners at this point.
Sorry to the trumpet.
Luckily, no triangle players are listening. They're not fit for this sort of podcast. Sorry, carry on.
But then, later in 1976, further discoveries are made where they realize that they've hit the mother lode. And let's go back to Rudecindo. Do you know what Rudecindo's last name was?
I can see it here, but I'm going to pretend like I can't. What is it, Tavo?
Well, actually, I've deceived you deliberately.
Oh,
Rudecindo,
wow, you cheat. It's not Jimenez, as it says on this document I have before me.
Well, that was his maternal last name, because his paternal last name was Cantarell. Rudecindo Cantarell Jimenez. And that name will be familiar to listeners because that is the name given to one of the largest oil deposits ever found in history, in honor of this lovely fisherman who first identified it.
That's a lovely story. I didn't know that. And I'm glad he got the name, given that he probably didn't get a cent after that.
I'm certain he didn't get a cent. But anyways, what is Cantarell? Cantarell is this colossal oil well in the middle of the Mexican Gulf, between Tabasco and Campeche, and it is the reason why Mexico suddenly becomes a major player. Back to the symphony example, suddenly Mexico's promoted to first violin. Maybe not the first violin, but it's at the very front now.
And there's a sort of monkey paw wish, like destiny about this. Monkey paw being that weird trope where in a story you get a monkey paw and you ask it for a wish and one of the fingers comes down, and it's always an ironic twist. It's all, you get the wish, but at a terrible price. And this feels very monkey paw because Mexico discovers this oil right as it's trying to pull itself out of different sort of addiction, which is an addiction to debt. Isn't that true? We discussed this previously and why industrial policy doesn't work in Mexico. I'll link in the show notes. But why don't you remind us a bit about that, Tavo?
Well, yeah, not to get too much into the weeds, but towards the end of the 1960s, the economic model that Mexico had followed for a very long time is beginning to fail. And a new president comes in 1970, Luis Echeverria, and he decides to spend like crazy, print money and take on debt to sort of finance these grand government spending schemes that he thought would sort of redistribute wealth and restart growth in the country. And he leaves office right as Cantarell is about to be discovered. And this is where debt and oil come together. And this is very much why the monkey paw example, or the monkey paw point becomes really, really relevant. Because the next guy that comes in, López Portillo, he promises to behave. He's like, sorry, guys, that was too much. We'll behave from now on. But right as he says that, it becomes apparent that Cantarell is going to change everything. Mexico's now in the oil big leagues. And what do we do with that? Do we behave reasonably and we put all that money into a nice fund and ensure the generations to come will be able to enjoy it? Absolutely not. We spend all of it and we take on enormous amounts of debt under the promise that this oil gift will continue to give on giving forever.
There's a wonderful phrase, isn't there, which is the definition of jinxing it.
Yes, López Portillo comes out and basically says, we're rich now, guys. We need to learn to administer abundance. Tenemos que aprender a administrar la abundancia. Because Mexico suddenly had abundance. Mexico was now rich. After 20 years, 30 years of very significant growth with low inflation, suddenly it's been given this gift. The stage is set for Mexico to become a first world country. The problem is that Mr. Portillo begins to spend Mexico were already a first world country. There's instances, for example, of him taking a grand piano with him to Madrid for like a week. And this kind of behavior, these are little examples, but this kind of behavior became wholesale all over the country.
Absolutely. I only take my grand piano when it's about 2 weeks at least. Otherwise, it's not worth it.
That's the bare minimum. Um, and the real problem that happened here is Mexico didn't plan anything. Like, I understand that in a country that wasn't super rich, that you would want to spend the money quickly. There's political reasons to spend the money as well. And to be fair with López Portillo, the years that Mexico has grown the most in its entire modern history were during his presidency. We're talking 8% rates of growth. For a relatively rich country, 8% rate of growth is extraordinary. And that has only been achieved under López Portillo. So there were obviously benefits of spending this money. The problem is, with no real planning and taking on substantial amounts of debt, the stage was set for many, many problems to come. Now, Mexico was able to get away with this for a super long time because there was so much oil that was coming out of the ground that it could take on the inefficiency and the lack of planning and the corruption, which was rampant, because there would be enough money to cover it. Now, there's two problems here. The most obvious one, which people will know, is that in 1981 and 80, oil prices fall dramatically. And certainly Mexico's sitting on a bunch of debt based on expected future cash flows on oil, which is now selling at significantly lower prices. So that's a big problem. And that creates a series of fiscal problems for the country. It leads to devaluation and economic crisis. But the second problem is that even though it's giving less money because oil prices have fallen, as we've said, by 1987, Pemex is worth more than 40% of the fiscal revenues of the country. So the government learns to depend enormously on Pemex. And that means that Pemex, which is a state-owned enterprise, cannot prioritize its sustainable long-term growth because it has to prioritize funding the government, a government that is profoundly corrupt at this point.
And it's even worse than that, though, isn't it? Because especially as someone who was in the operational side of Pemex when you were there, the big issue is when you're funding the government's debt, you're not funding exploration, you're not funding R&D, all the stuff you probably should have done to keep flows going. So what's up with that?
Definitely. And I actually have a wonderful example of this. I worked with them in 2016. We were brought in the context of, once again, huge fall in oil prices. And Pemex had to deal with dramatic cuts in its operating budget. And we were brought in specifically to the maintenance division of the region around, the region that encompasses Cantarell and all the other major oil fields of Pemex. And when we were there, what we understood very quickly was that Pemex had never really learned to do maintenance. Maintenance was sort of a secondary thing. The way these kinds of massive assets, in oil, in mining, in cement, the way they operate is that you need to have recurrent shutdowns. What does that mean? Like, you literally shut down the operation for months because there's only so much maintenance that you can do with things running as normal. At some point, you need to stop everything and change pipe, empty all sorts of things and refill them and blah, 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 blah. This is very expensive, but more importantly, while you do that, you're not taking oil out of the ground. So there's a big opportunity cost, but it's an opportunity cost that you need to accept because otherwise you set the stage for enormous problems down the line, explosions, inefficiencies, and so on. When we arrived in 2016, what was very clear to us was that this had been the MO pretty much since 1976.
What had been the MO?
To not do proper maintenance, to not allow the shutdowns to happen. Of course, they had to happen. Of course, they had to happen to some degree. Otherwise, everything would have blown up already. But let's say if you need to take your car to the shop once a year or every 10,000 kilometers or whatever, well, these guys were bringing it in every 2.5 years, every 25,000 kilometers. A light is on, but it's fine. It'll run. And it did run. But you're not going to have that car for a very, very long time if you keep up this behavior. And that is the behavior that Pemex kept up for a very long time. So there's this hierarchy where Pemex Exploración y Producción, exploration and production, is the first amongst equals of Pemex because that's where all the oil comes from. And within that, you have sort of like fiefdoms. Everyone who is in charge of a different oil field, Cantarell, for example, is sort of has a fiefdom. And even though they're supposed to report to people and they're supposed to be accountable to people, because they're the ones in charge of all the oil coming out, they're untouchable. So the ships would be sent in for maintenance. It was all agreed. It came from above, blah, 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 blah. And when the ships arrived, and these ships cost hundreds of thousands of dollars a week, plus all the people inside of them and so on, these sort of dukes of the fiefdom would say, well, you can't board. I'm not allowing a shutdown.
Are these like administrators?
Yes, let's say like in the same way that you have a plant director, you have a oil field director. But these guys, in the same way that on a ship or on a plane, the captain reigns supreme, even though there might be a CEO. It's the same idea. Here, I'm in charge. So you'd have these ships arrive to do a shutdown or to do maintenance that required to be done, and they say, well, we need to slow down production for 5 days. And these guys would say, no, you're not allowed on. You can't do it. And this had been going on for decades. Now, you can get away with this sort of behavior if you overspend as well. So let's say you're doing this with your car, you didn't bring it in when you should, something exploded. Fine, take it to the shop, it's expensive, they'll fix it, it'll be fine. But what happens when you run out of money? Now you're in real trouble because you have this behavior and you've had this behavior forever, but now you don't have the cash to afford misbehaving and taking it to the expensive garage. So you need to completely change the way you work. You need to completely reimagine your approach to everything, to organizational structures, to order following and not following, to strategic planning, because otherwise you're going to run out of money.
And here there's a distinct lack of imagination, as far as I can see, because you've got different power players expecting different things from the national oil company, and none of that involves stopping producing oil at any point. So you've got the government, which needs its debts paid. You've got the union, which is notoriously corrupt, and it probably doesn't want to stop at any point because it's got its deals and it's got to siphon off like X amount of money. So something's got to give, right?
Exactly. And I always find it really annoying when I read articles by, say, former directors of Pemex or former high-ranking members of Pemex. Adrian Layou, for example, who was the CEO of Pemex in the 90s. Brilliant man, academic, on top of a brilliant executive. And he writes a lot of things saying like, oh, like all these mistakes were made, like there wasn't discipline and we didn't do things properly. Well, you didn't do things properly when you were CEO either, buddy. But everyone always complains about the other guy. And to be fair to these people, like there's so many layers, as you're saying, of sort of accountability or dependency that the CEO can't really do that much. But everyone is always saying, we need to stop corruption. Cool, let's stop it. And then they don't. And this, of course, has led to inevitable decline. This goes beyond the prices of Pemex of oil falling. This goes beyond sort of the macroeconomic situation. When you continue to misbehave, when you continue to avoid real strategic planning, and that comes sometimes with trade-offs and opportunity costs. If you refuse to accept this, if you refuse to sort of grow up, let's say, and deal with the consequences of things appropriately, you're going to walk yourself into a world of pain, which is what happened to Pemex. Towards the late 90s, it became apparent that the crown jewel, Cantarell, amongst others, were going to begin to lose the ability to produce. By the late 90s, Cantarell had lost over 40% of its pressure. That's the ability of the well to naturally just shoot the oil up. And when that happens, you need to inject certain things into the well and manage the well in a different way so that you can make the best of it for the longest amount of time. Now, of course, this means that you have to be strategic and you need to understand trade-offs and so on, which, as we've said, Pemex is not very good at. In the late 1990s, an idea was proposed, which it wasn't invented by Pemex, this is done widely, which is to inject nitrogen in addition to other things like gas back into the well, sort of to create pressure that would sort of keep the pressure of the well constant or relatively high for the oil to continue to come out. The problem is the sins of the father, let's say, became quite apparent very quickly because now we start going into this phase of it's not just unlimited money. Now we need to think about how we do things. We need to take decisions rationally. We need to talk about things and follow a plan. And Pemex is not very good at that. So what happened was that, yes, the nitrogen was injected into the well, but it was done with a view towards continuing to have as much production as possible. But when you're dealing with a mature well, you can't do that. You need to understand that it's going to give you less, but if you treat it with care, it will give you less, yes, but for a very long time. If you don't treat it with care, it's going to give you still less, but for a very short time. Imagine having a horse, and you've ridden this horse up until they're like 16, and they galloped and jumped, and it was great. And a horse can live up to like 30. Now, of course, you can't keep galloping them super hard from 16 to 30. They're going to die. Well, they gallop the horse, basically.
At this point, they're whipping a dead horse.
Exactly. And what follows is that Cantarell was essentially ruined. It is believed that Cantarell, in addition to other wells, could have given, yes, less production, but more than it's giving now for a much longer amount of time. But this obsession with prioritizing production in the short term and not looking at the long term has come to collect for Pemex quite aggressively. Since 2004, Pemex has done nothing but produce less and less every year.
And borrow more and more to be able to keep production up, which you can actually see in some statistics that the government has published literally today as we're speaking, where you can see from 2004 just a seminal climb of debt owned by Pemex, reaching pretty big highs just a couple of years ago when it became a dire problem and something had to be done.
Exactly. And again, it's about the discipline. If you are disciplined and you cut down expenses when the money runs out, then you should be able to make do without necessarily a ton of debt. But if you've never learned to behave, if you've never learned to be responsible in managing your finances and following instructions and plans, then you need debt and more debt and more debt, and you just go right through it. And that is what has happened to Pemex. That, in addition to neglecting the company enormously. There's a stat which I read today, which I thought was extraordinary. This is something I actually got from Adrian Layu, the CEO of Pemex, who I mentioned. By the end of 2017, so we're approaching the end of the Peña administration, drilling for new deposits, so new oil wells, had fallen by over 95% as compared to the end of the previous administration 5 years prior, under Calderón in 2012. So a 95% decline in seeking to expand your production, in exploration, investing in the future, in only 5 years is extraordinary. It shows that the Peña Nieto administration had sort of given up on Pemex. And maybe they were right. At one point in 2016, when we were called in to help, we were doing a tremendous amount of work to try and fix the situation. When I arrived, their operating budget had been cut by a third. By the time I'd left, it had been cut by a further third. They really needed to reimagine the way they did things. And I had this moment where I was rewriting processes for them to be leaner, to be more efficient. And it became apparent to me that maybe Pemex is not salvageable. Because typically, the complaint about Pemex is about corruption and incompetence. Yes, Pemex is corrupt. There's estimates of about $1 billion lost a year to corruption. How you get to this number is unclear to me, but this is an estimate that is often given. But $1 billion is not that much for an oil company. Now, incompetence, yes, I met a lot of incompetent people while I was there, but not the majority. What was really sad to me was that the majority of the people who I met there were competent, educated, exceptionally hardworking, and honest people. And yet nothing worked ever. I think the real problem was that there's a deeply embedded work culture that is archaic, that is just profoundly inefficient, that is really hard to take away from people's minds. One example that I had is as I was rewriting these processes to be leaner, I would come and present these processes to people, and I would explain, like, we need to remove all the things that are unnecessary so we can move a lot faster, right? We need to take days away from the decision-making process so that we can move faster, because every day lost is money lost, right? Like, yeah, of course, we understand that. So I would remove all the unnecessary sort of extra validations from everyone that needed to sign papers and that were sent from Campeche to Mexico City and back. And as I explained this and everyone agreed, when I asked for their feedback, they would say, you know what we should have? we should have a validation here and here and here. And then someone would respond, yes, but I also need to validate it. By the end of the feedback, we were back to the original MO. And it reminded me a little bit of Chicken Run, when there's the main character, who's a chicken, who's trying to sell the idea of freedom and and liberty to the other chickens, and they just don't get it. And he keeps saying, like, we should leave here, leave the farm, so that there's no farm and there's no farmer, and we can be happy. And then one of the characters keeps asking, but where's the farm? And where's the farmer? He's like, there is no farm. There's no farm. Is he on holiday? It's like, no, it doesn't exist. You don't need them.
And ultimately, I think this is where the real debate begins, Tavo, because it's easy to say, let's do things better. But what better means to a bunch of different interests is what I think we're going to be talking about in the next episode. So this is episode 1 of Pemex, its history and foibles. But we're going to go into episode 2, where we're going to answer, why can't you just be better? And the answer is actually surprisingly interesting. Of course, there's loads of corruption and intrigue, but it's also an incredible story about Mexico's third rail. In the same way, in the UK, moving the NHS about is a massive issue, and touching social security in the United States can be pretty politically poisonous. In Mexico, that's Pemex, and that results in some pretty crazy outcomes, which annoy the consultant types like Tavo, but which, in combination, don't make any sense to anybody. But if you start picking the bits apart, you start to see the different strands of logic running through the policy until today, where Mexico is basically being held hostage by Pemex. But more on that in the next episode. For now, I'm Alex Gonzalez-Ormerod.
And I'm Tavo Figueroa.
And this is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we'll take you through Mexico's history, politics, economics,
and what makes Mexico and all the state-run companies it owns tick. Sign up to the Mexico Political Economist for more of this, and we'll see you next time for more Pemex.